I'm Josh Swartz,
And I'm William Illingworth.
host of the High Tech Podcast, a part of the Education Podcast Network, just like the show you're listening to now.
Shows on the network are individually owned, and opinions expressed may not reflect others.
Find other interesting education podcasts at edupodcastnetwork.com.
Coming up on episode 253 of the House of EdTech podcast, we're going to talk about monetizing your podcast as I address chapter 6 of my book, I Like to Podcast, and you will too. Strike up the band. Welcome to the House of EdTech. My name is Chris Nessie. The House of EdTech launched in 2014, giving me the opportunity to speak with teachers, leaders, and creators so you can more effectively integrate technology, strengthen your pedagogy, and have more confidence in your classroom and school so you can make an impact. Get involved with the podcast by visiting my website, chrisnessie.com. Using technology isn't difficult, and this is where it begins. This is the House of EdTech. That's right, it is the House of EdTech podcast. Thank you for making the show part of your anytime, anywhere professional development. If you're a new listener, welcome aboard. If you are a returning listener, welcome back. We are still in the midst of this series where I'm going through the book I Like to Podcast, and you will too, a House of EdTech guide to podcasting. And this week I am bringing you chapter 6, where I will talk about how to monetize your podcast. Now, if you're using this information for yourself, that's fantastic. If you're using this information to encourage your students to podcast, that is equally as fantastic. And your students might also be curious about how they can make money doing this thing we call podcasting. And if you're doing it for yourself or you're interested, you might have questions about that too. Now, I do mention this in chapter 6, but I do want to talk about it freely here up front, and that is the fact that you don't have to make money with your podcast. You can have a hobby podcast that you do entirely for free, and you can have a great time doing it. But if you have any inclination or any desire to make money, then you have to decide where does that goal, how are you prioritizing that? If it's your number one goal, then be honest and upfront with yourself about that, because that's going to impact how you create your podcast. Okay? Now, as we get into this, I do want to remind you that, as I've said in the previous episodes, that this book I self-published in August of 2023. And of course, in addition to going through the next chapter, as I read it, I will be throwing in other nuggets of information and some additional commentary on the topic of podcasting. Now, if you would like to pick up a copy of the book for yourself or someone else, you can go to chrisnessie.com/I-like-to-podcast. The book is available physically, and it's also available for your Kindle. If you don't want to pick up a copy of the book, but you are getting value and you want to show your support, you can go to chrisnessie.com/support, and there are a number of ways that you can support what I'm doing here with the House of EdTech podcast, which is one of the ways that I monetize the House of EdTech. Again, am I going to get rich in how I monetize the show? No. Am I going to retire early? No. Does it help me pay the podcast bills? Absolutely. Does it help support things that I want to do with technology for the podcast and professionally? Yes, it does. Just putting it out there. I'd also like to invite you to join the Discord community, where we can discuss the book, we can talk about technology, we can talk about education. If you are on Discord, go to chrisnessie.com/Discord. If you're not familiar with the Discord platform, go to that website anyway, and it's real easy to use. I would love to have you be a part of the community. And speaking of being a part of the community, I want to quickly remind you that the 2024 House of EdTech Smackdown is coming soon. It's going to be episode number 257, and that's going to be released on December 22nd, 2024. The way that this goes, this will be the 11th EdTech Smackdown that I'm running, and it's the last calendar episode of the year, and It's where I turn the show over to you, the listener, and you get the opportunity to share what you loved in EdTech this year. So come at me with your EdTech recommendations, your EdTech tools, tips, tricks. Share it all. If you want to see what's been done in the past, and it's okay to repeat things, because if it's a worthwhile tool and it hasn't been killed off by Google or somebody else, and it's still valuable, we can still talk about it here in 2024. If you want to see the all-time SmackDown list, go to chrisnessy.com/all-time SmackDown. And if you want to participate in the SmackDown, you've got to send me your audio by December 20th, 2024. And I'm very excited. I've already got one submission. So get in now. And again, you could email me, you could send me a DM, but send me audio. It's a podcast. I want to play your voice on the House of EdTech SmackDown. And again, that'll be episode 257 coming your way on December 22nd, 2024. And if you're listening to this episode after that, go listen to episode 257. And depending on when you're hearing this, get involved in the next House of EdTech SmackDown. And now, without further ado, let's get back into I Like to Podcast and You Will Too, a House of EdTech guide to podcasting. And today we're talking Chapter 6, Monetizing Your Podcast. Chapter 6, Monetizing Your Podcast. In today's digital age, podcasts have become a popular medium for sharing ideas, stories, and information. As a result, many podcasters are looking for ways to turn their passion into a profitable venture. In this chapter, we will explore some of the most effective ways to monetize your podcast, including advertising, sponsorships, and selling merchandise. We will also discuss the importance of building a loyal audience and creating high-quality content in order to maximize your income potential. By the end of this chapter, you will have a better understanding of how to monetize your podcast and take the first steps toward financial success. First question: do you need to monetize your podcast? Whether or not you need to monetize your podcast will depend on your individual goals and circumstances. If you are creating a podcast as a hobby and are not interested in generating income from it, then you may not need to monetize your show. On the other hand, if you are looking to make a living from your podcast or use it as a way to promote your business, then monetizing your show will likely be an important part of achieving your goals. Why should you consider monetizing your podcast? Whether or not you need to monetize your podcast will depend on your individual goals and circumstances. If you are looking to make a living from your podcast or use it as a way to promote your business, then monetizing your show will be an important part of achieving the goal. There are several reasons why you may want to consider monetizing your podcast, including making a living, supporting your business, creating high-quality content, and building a loyal audience. Monetizing your podcast can provide you with the resources and financial support to invest in your show and turn your passion into a profitable venture. Here are some strategies for monetizing your podcast. There are several ways to monetize a podcast, including number 1, advertising. One of the most common ways to monetize a podcast is by selling advertising space. You can either sell ads directly to advertisers or use an advertising network to help you find and place ads. Number 2, sponsorship. Another way to monetize your podcast is by securing sponsorships from companies or organizations that are interested in reaching your audience. Sponsorships typically involve a company paying you to mention their product or service on your show. Number 3, crowdfunding. Crowdfunding is a way that allows listeners to support their favorite creators by making recurring payments, sometimes known as pledges. Podcasters can use a platform like Patreon to offer exclusive content or perks to their supporters in exchange for their support. Number 4, merchandise. If you have a loyal and engaged audience, you could sell merchandise such as t-shirts, stickers, or other branded items to generate income. Number 5, courses and workshops. If you have expertise in a particular subject, you could create and sell online courses or workshops to your audience. Number 6, consulting and coaching. If you have a successful podcast, you may be able to leverage your expertise to offer consulting or coaching services to others in your field. It's important to note that the best way to monetize your podcast will depend on your specific audience and the content of your show. It may take some experimentation to find the right approach for your particular situation. Now, I want to jump in here. Ultimately, do you need to monetize your podcast? No, you don't. But like me, maybe you want to offset some of the costs. Maybe you want to use funding to invest in your equipment, your setup, and you want to continue to keep the podcast going. Generating some income to offset some of the costs, that can be a very positive thing. The other thing that you need to consider is that when you monetize your podcast, you're not monetizing the podcast itself. You are monetizing the audience. So, for example, selling copies of this book, having the awesome supporters. At times I've had sponsored episodes and advertising here on the House of EdTech. I have monetized you, the audience, with the hopes of having you take the money out of your wallet and get that money into mine. Not because I want to retire, but podcasting isn't free, although it can be, but I choose to do things that do cost money. But just know that when you sell ads, you are putting those ads in the ears of your audience. Personally, I would love to have this podcast be entirely crowd-funded. So, are the advertising dollars nice? Yeah, but that does come at a cost. You have to have ads in the podcast. You are listening to ads when I put them in, if I'm able to secure ads like that. Again, I would like to have this be entirely listener supported. So if you're interested in supporting the podcast as a listener, go to chrisnessy.com/awesome. And that'll take you to what I currently use, Patreon. If you go to chrisnessy.com/support, you could buy me a coffee, become an awesome supporter, or I am experimenting with Supercast. So I'll have more about that soon. But it is available. But while I don't know if it's quite ready for prime time, it is available. So I am experimenting with Supercast, and I might be replacing Patreon as my crowdfunding platform. But that's neither here nor there. Let's get back into the book. Set up a system for receiving payments for your podcast. To set up a system for receiving payments for your podcast, you will need to choose a payment processor that is compatible with your needs and the preferences of your audience. Some popular options include PayPal, Stripe, and Square. Once you have a chosen payment processor, you will need to create an account and set up your payment preferences. This will typically involve providing your personal and financial information, as well as setting up your payment methods and account preferences. Once your account is set up, you can start accepting payments for your podcast. To facilitate payments, you will need to provide a way for your audience to make payments, such as a link through your website or a button on your podcast page. You can also use a platform like Patreon or, as I'm experimenting with now, Supercast, and this allows listeners to support their favorite creators by making recurring payments. Patreon makes it easy to manage your supporters and offer exclusive content or perks in exchange for their support. Side note, I don't do any extra content. If you want to support the podcast, you can become an awesome supporter. I'm not able to do anything extra for people who support the podcast, and I'm just going on the value for value model. If you get value from this podcast and you'd like to show me what it's worth, then that option is available to you. It's important to remember that different payment processors may have different fees and restrictions, so it's important to do your research and choose the option that is right for you. You should also make sure to comply with any relevant laws and regulations regarding online payments and financial transactions. What is the importance of building a loyal audience? Building a loyal podcast audience is important for a number of reasons. First, a loyal audience can provide you with a consistent and dedicated group of listeners who are invested in your content and are more likely to support you through monetization efforts. This can help to ensure the success and sustainability of your podcast. Secondly, a loyal audience can provide valuable feedback and insights that can help you improve your content and grow your show. By engaging with your audience and soliciting their feedback, you can learn what they like and don't like about your show, and use that information to make improvements and continue to grow. Thirdly, a loyal audience can also help to increase the visibility and reach of your podcast. By sharing your content with their friends and followers, your audience can help spread the word about your show and attract new listeners. This can help to increase your audience size and ultimately, if you're monetizing, potentially drive more revenue to your podcast. There are several ways that a podcaster can build a loyal audience, including: number 1, create high-quality content. Providing valuable and engaging content is essential for building a loyal audience. By consistently delivering content that is interesting, informative, and entertaining, you can attract and retain listeners who are interested in your show. Number 2, engage with your audience. Building a loyal audience is not a one-way street. You need to actively engage with your listeners in order to build a relationship with them and foster a sense of community. This can involve responding to comments and messages, soliciting feedback, and interacting with your audience on social media. Number 3, offer exclusive content or perks. One way to build a loyal audience is by offering exclusive content or perks that are only available to your most dedicated listeners. This could include bonus episodes, behind-the-scenes content, or access to special events or merchandise. By providing these perks, you can incentivize your audience to support you and become more invested in your success. Number 4, consistency. Consistency is also important for building a loyal audience. By releasing new episodes on a regular schedule, you can help your audience to know what to expect and when to tune in. This can help build anticipation and create a sense of loyalty among your listeners. Building a loyal audience requires effort and dedication, but the rewards can be well worth it. By providing valuable content, engaging with your audience, and offering exclusive perks, you can foster a sense of community and create a dedicated group of supporters who are invested in your podcast success. By engaging with your audience and providing them with valuable content, you can foster a sense of community and create a dedicated group of supporters who, again, are invested in your success. You can also profit from your podcast without making money. While monetizing your podcast is a common way to generate income, it's not the only way to profit from your show. In fact, there are many ways to profit from your podcast without making actual money. Some examples include: number 1, building your brand. By creating a successful podcast, you can increase your visibility and establish yourself as an expert in your field. This can lead to opportunities for speaking engagements, consulting work, or other forms of income. Number 2, promoting a business. If you have a business or product, a podcast can be a powerful marketing tool. By providing valuable content and engaging with your audience, you can promote your business and potentially attract new customers. Number 3, networking. Podcasting can also be a great way to make connections in the field and build relationships with other experts. By interviewing guests or collaborating with other podcasters, you can expand your network and potentially open up new opportunities for yourself. And number 4, personal growth. Finally, creating a successful podcast can also be personally rewarding. By sharing your ideas and stories with a wider audience, you can help to inspire and educate others, which can be deeply fulfilling. There are many ways to profit from your podcast beyond making actual money. Focus on your brand, promote your business, networking, and just personal growth. Doing these things, you can create a successful and rewarding podcasting venture. Let's wrap up this chapter. Monetizing your podcast can be a great way to turn your passion into a profitable venture. By exploring the various ways to generate income from your show, including advertising, sponsorships, merchandise, you can determine the best approach for your situation. Building a loyal audience and creating high-quality content are also essential for maximizing your income potential and ensuring the success of your podcast. By following some of the strategies outlined in this chapter, you can take the first steps toward monetizing your podcast and achieving your goal for financial success. All right, what are the key takeaways to Chapter 6? Are you considering monetizing a podcast, and should you? Ultimately, you can just have a hobby podcast and speak about your passion and your topic and just have fun. But in order to monetize your podcast effectively, you have to assess your goals and your circumstances. If your goal is to make money from a podcast, then make that your goal. Set a number and try to achieve that goal. But if your goal is not to make money, don't think about it then. Don't try to make money with your podcast. And it's okay if your goals change. You might start out not wanting to monetize, and then after some time, decide that it's something you'd like to do. And that's okay. Consider the strategies for monetizing. When it comes to monetizing your podcast, there are a number of strategies available to you. Advertising, sponsorships, crowdfunding, merchandise, courses, consulting. In my opinion, I think crowdfunding is a great way to monetize your podcast. Sponsorships and advertising might lead to bigger dollars much quicker, but again, you're not monetizing your podcast, you're monetizing the audience. And I think crowdfunding is a nice balance. Merchandise is fun, and if you are like me, maybe you could develop courses, workshops, although I'm willing to talk to anybody, so I'm not about to, sell, courses or take the time to do that. But that's me, right? I'll get on a Google Hangout or a Zoom call if you reach out to me with questions about anything related to education and technology. Now, if a lot of people were doing that, I might start to feel that my time is worth something. So maybe it will be in the future, but right now, I have the time to just give away for free. Or there's, buy me a coffee or becoming an awesome supporter, which I've had people do that. Explore the different methods and select the ones that best align with your audience and your content. And above all, build a loyal audience. Building the loyal audience is critical if you want to monetize your podcast, whether for money or not for actual dollars. To achieve this, you need to focus on high-quality content that will attract and retain listeners. Inspire your audience to share your content. Inspire your audience by interacting with them. Reply to all of the comments you can. Reply to all of the messages you can. Consistency in releasing episodes is also key. By building a loyal audience, you increase the visibility and reach of your podcast. This dedicated group of supporters will provide you with consistent support and valuable feedback, helping you refine your content and drive the success of your podcast. I hope you enjoyed Chapter 6, Monetizing Your Podcast. And, just a couple of notes on if this is something you're considering doing, if you're starting your podcast, or if this is something you're considering doing if you've already launched your podcast. Again, as I said at the beginning, you don't necessarily need to monetize, okay? You can certainly have either a professional or a hobby podcast that is either just for fun or maybe an extension of what you do professionally, and you don't necessarily need to make money. Anybody who monetizes their podcast monetizes it for any number of reasons. I can only speak for what I do, and when I started this show, I did not have it monetized. I mean, I had a sponsor very early on. If you remember todaysmeet.com, Today's Meet was a one-man operation who paid me $25 per episode and was a sponsor on and off for the first couple of years. And Today's Meet was a fantastic back-channeling tool. Remember when back-channeling in education was a big-time buzzword and a big concept? That helped to offset the cost of my website, my domain name, and paying for hosting, the media hosting, once I got into paying for it. Because fun fact, and I didn't mention this in my episode on Media Host, I started this podcast by hosting it on Google Drive. And then I started to get messages from people who said, hey, I'm subscribed to your podcast, and the episodes won't download, which meant to me that, enough people are listening where I can't host it for free on Google Drive anymore. So that's when I moved over to Libsyn, Liberated Syndication, Libsyn.com for my media hosting. And that cost me $7 per month, plus the domain name, and now I have my big fancy pod page website. So I monetize this podcast not to retire early, not to get rich, but to offset the cost of the things that it takes to put the podcast together, as well as my time. So that's where I'm at, and there's been that shift for me. So if you get value, you can buy the book, you can buy merch. So I do a lot of things, but again, it depends on your audience if people will engage with your monetization options. But just know this, I'm not trying to get rich quick, and I'm not trying to retire early. I love doing the podcast, and there are just the certain things that I do that I offer and make available. I would like to move in a direction where the podcast is entirely listener supported. So the awesome supporters, which I will shout out before we say goodbye today, as I do in every episode, I shout out my awesome supporters. And that's a nice little bit of love I can show each and every one of them, and offering value. So for example, as I'm recording this episode, I am live on Instagram at House of Ed Tech, recording this episode, but also live streaming to a couple of people. Shout out to Lil Cat 19107. Shout out to Leo in Brazil, and shout out to Mr. Borgman EDU, who are checking out the recording of this episode on Instagram. And I'm going to do some more behind the scenes work. I want to do more tips and tutorials and things, but my time is valuable. So another way that I'm monetizing my efforts is offering people the ability to subscribe to me on Instagram. And once I get going there, again, not retiring, but to make it worth my time and effort, I will make that content for the people who are supporting my time and effort in that arena. But for you, I don't know. If you have more questions about monetization, feel free to reach out to me. If you are podcasting and monetizing, what are you doing? What has worked? What hasn't worked? If you are on the fence about monetizing your content, what is holding you back? And if it's, I'd feel uncomfortable asking. Yeah, it is uncomfortable asking if you've never asked. You're literally asking for money. That can be uncomfortable and awkward. But you do it once, and then you come up with a way to promote it and say it, you get more comfortable. Again, the money isn't going to fall from heaven once you start saying it out loud. But again, keep your goals and your priorities in order, and you will see what happens for you. So that's really all I have to say on monetization. There are all sorts of ways to do it, and I would love to learn what you're doing that's successful, and we can continue this conversation. So again, join that Discord, chrisnessy.com/Discord. We can chat there, and I look forward to seeing you in the next episode. So for now, let us wrap up this one. Thank you for listening to this episode of the House of EdTech podcast. Please subscribe or follow the podcast wherever you're listening right now, and continue to make this a part of your anytime, anywhere professional development. Links and resources for this episode can be found on my website, and the show notes can be found at chrisnessy.com/253, as in episode 253. I also want to hear from you. I value your feedback, and I value your perspective. Don't hesitate to reach out. I asked a bunch of questions throughout the chapter and in my little closing just a few moments ago. So send your thoughts, send your questions about this content or any EdTech related topic. You can email me, feedback@chrisnessy.com, or better yet, because it's a podcast, send me a voicemail. Go to chrisnessy.com/voicemail. I can't wait to connect. I also encourage you to share this podcast with another educator who would get value from it. Spread the word and help me reach as many educators as possible. And thank you in advance. Lastly, I want to invite you to become an awesome supporter if you're getting value from my content. I am incredibly grateful for the ongoing support from the following people: Leo Calbush, Brian Carpenter, Aaron Cummings, Jeff Herb, Peggy George, and Matt Miller. If you've gotten value from this podcast and you want to become an awesome supporter, go to chrisnessy.com/awesome, and you can become an awesome supporter. The next episode of the podcast is going to be episode number 254, and we will tackle chapter 7 of the book, Growing Your Podcast Audience and Building Your Brand. That's going to come your way on November 17th, 2024. And as I close out the episode, I want to give a preemptive happy 45th wedding anniversary to my parents. My dad, the original Mr. Nessie, he was on episode 100 of the podcast. You could check that out at chrisnessy.com/100, and still my top episode of all time for the podcast. Until next time, I want to thank you for learning with me. Hope you're enjoying the audible version of the book. And I want you to remember, as always, using technology isn't difficult. Just give it a try.